The trading station floated in space like a metal island among the stars, and thousands of people from different worlds came here to buy and sell and trade, and Jake Morrison was just trying to fix a broken cooling unit when everything went wrong. Was 23 years old and worked maintenance on the station for almost 2 years now. And the pay was decent and the work kept him busy, and he never expected to be anywhere near important events or famous people. And that was fine with him, because simple was good. The cooling unit was giving him trouble, and he lay on his back under the machine with grease on his hands and sweat on his forehead, and the wrench kept slipping, and he cursed quietly and tried again, and then he heard the explosion. It was not close, but it was loud enough to feel, and the floor shook under him, and he hit his head on the machine and rolled out fast and grabbed his tool bag and started running toward the market section, and his training said to run, away from danger, but something in his gut said, people might need help. The corridor filled with smoke and people ran past him screaming and crying, and he pushed against the crowd and kept going forward, and his heart pounded in his chest and his hands shook, but he did not stop. And when he reached the market, the smoke cleared enough to see a woman lay trapped under a collapsed vendor stall, and she had silver hair that shined even through the smoke, and her ears came to points, and her skin looked pale like moonlight, and 2 massive creatures circled above her in the high ceiling, and their scales caught the emergency lights and shimmered with colors that hurt to look at. 3 figures in dark armor moved toward the trapped woman, and they carried weapons that glowed with energy, and Jake knew those were military-grade blasters and way above his pay level, and he should turn around and let security handle this, and he took a step back. The woman looked up and her eyes met his, and they were violet like no human eyes he ever saw. And she was terrified and trying to stay brave, and one of the armored figures raised his weapon and pointed it at her head. Jake ran. He did not think about it and did not plan it, and his legs just moved, and he crossed the distance between them in seconds, and the first blast meant for her hit him in the shoulder instead. And it felt like someone shoved a burning iron rod through his flesh, and he screamed but kept moving. He threw himself over her body and covered her completely, and 2 more blasts hit his back, and the pain was so bad he could not breathe, and his vision went white, and he felt her hands on his chest trying to push him off, and she was saying something in a language he did not understand. The dragons came down like falling mountains, and their roar shook the entire station and made his bones vibrate, and he felt the heat from their breath and heard the armored figures screaming and running and the sound of claws on metal. And then everything got quiet except for the alarms. People were pulling at him and trying to move him, and he wanted to tell them to help the woman first, but his mouth would not work. And someone rolled him over, and he saw her face above him, and she was crying and talking fast in that strange language, and her hands glowed with soft light as she touched his wound station. Security arrived in their yellow uniforms, and medics came with floating stretchers, and someone kept asking him why he did it and what was he thinking, and he tried to answer, but everything was getting dark, and the last thing he saw was the woman's violet eyes watching him, and one of the dragons lowering its massive head to look at him closely. He woke up 3 times over the next few days, and each time was confusing and strange. The first time he opened his eyes and saw a ceiling that curved in ways that made no sense, and the walls seemed to breathe, and soft blue light came from everywhere and nowhere, and a machine beside him hummed with sounds that felt alive. And he tried to sit up, but pain shot through his body, and he passed out again. The second time, a woman in white robes stood over him, and she had pointed ears like the woman from the market, and she was doing something to his shoulder and speaking in that musical language, and her hands glowed the same way, and he felt warmth spread through his wounds, and the pain faded a little, and he slept. The third time he actually stayed awake long enough to look around, and he was in a medical bay, but nothing looked like the station clinic, and the bed was too comfortable, and the air smelled like flowers and thunderstorms, and a man sat in a chair beside him, watching with eyes that held entire galaxies. The man was tall and thin, and had silver hair like the woman from the market, but his was longer and tied back, and he wore robes that seemed to shift colors when he moved, and his face was ancient and young at the same time, and when he spoke his voice was deep and calm. He said his name was Lord Theron of the Sylvan Reaches, and Jake had saved his daughter, Princess Lyra, from assassins who wanted to start a war between humans and the elder races. And now Jake was recovering in the Sylvan medical wing of the station, and had been unconscious for 3 days. Jake tried to process this and failed, and he asked if the woman was okay. And Theron smiled slightly and said she was fine thanks to him and wanted to visit, but he would not allow it until Jake was stronger. And Jake asked why he saved her, and Theron said that was what he wanted to know. Jake did not have a good answer, and he said he saw someone in trouble and just moved, and did not think about it. And Theron studied him for a long moment and said that was very human, and very foolish and very brave, and Jake was not sure if that was a compliment. The Lord explained that the attackers were caught and being questioned, and they were part of a radical group that wanted to drive humans out of elder space and thought killing his daughter at a human station would start the conflict they wanted, and Jake's intervention ruined their plan and saved countless lives. Jake said he was just a maintenance worker and did not save anyone important and just got lucky, and Theron's expression changed and he leaned forward and said that Jake saved the most important person in his world, and luck had nothing to do with taking 3 blaster shots meant for someone else. The conversation tired Jake out, and Theron saw this and stood to leave, and he said that Lyra would visit tomorrow, and that Jake should rest and recover, and they would talk more about the future when he was stronger. And Jake wanted to ask what that meant, but sleep pulled him down. He dreamed of violet eyes and dragon roars and burning pain. And when he woke again, it was morning and light streamed through windows that showed the station exterior and the stars beyond, and someone sat beside his bed. Princess Lyra looked exactly like he remembered, and her silver hair fell past her shoulders, and her violet eyes watched him with concern and relief, and she wore simple robes instead of anything fancy. And when she saw he was awake, she smiled, and it was like the sun coming up. She said hello in perfect English and asked how he felt, and he said he hurt, but was alive, and she laughed, and it sounded like music, and she said that was good, because her dragons wanted to meet the human who protected their bonded one. And she gestured to the corner. 2 massive creatures lay curled in a space that should not have fit them, and they watched Jake with intelligence that was definitely not animal, and one had scales like fire and the other like ice, and they were the most beautiful and terrifying things he ever saw. Lyra introduced them as Ember and Frost and said they remembered what he did and considered him Pack now, and Jake was not sure what that meant, but both dragons made a sound like purring thunder, and he decided it was probably good. Lyra visited Jake every day for the next 2 weeks, and she always brought Ember and Frost with her. And the medical staff got used to having 2 massive dragons curled up in the corner, while the princess sat beside a human maintenance worker and talked about everything and nothing. She asked him questions about Earth and human colonies and why humans did things that seemed reckless to longer-lived races, and Jake tried to explain that when you only lived maybe 80 years, you could not waste time thinking too long, and sometimes you had to act on feeling instead of logic. Lyra found this fascinating and said her people lived for thousands of years, and they planned everything carefully and thought about consequences that might not happen for centuries, and Jake said that sounded exhausting. And she laughed and agreed and said sometimes she wished she could just do things without endless debate. Jake asked about the dragons and how the bonding worked, and Lyra explained that Ember and Frost chose her when she was young, and they were connected in ways that went deeper than words, and she could feel their emotions and they could feel hers, and they would die protecting each other. He said that sounded intense, and she smiled and said it was but also beautiful, and lonely people never understood until they experienced it themselves. And then she got quiet and looked at him with an expression he could not read, and changed the subject. Lord Theron appeared often, in doorways and corridors, and Jake caught him watching their conversations and measuring every word and interaction, and it made him uncomfortable, but Lyra just rolled her eyes and said her father was trying to figure out if humans were brave or crazy and had not decided yet. The medical staff cleared Jake to walk around after the first week, and his wounds were healing faster than any human doctor said was possible, and Lyra explained that Sylvan medicine worked with the body's natural healing instead of against it. And Jake said that was amazing. And why did not humans have this? And she said, because humans never asked. He started physical therapy with a Sylvan healer named Kira, who did not speak much English and communicated mostly through gestures and firm pushes, and Jake learned quickly that Sylvan physical therapy was brutal, and his human body was not built for their exercises, but he kept trying. Lyra came to his sessions and cheered him on, and brought him water and wiped his forehead when he collapsed after trying to hold positions that her people could maintain for hours. and she never made him feel weak, even though he obviously was compared to her people. Ember and Frost watched these sessions with what Jake swore was amusement, and sometimes they would move beside him, and he could lean against their warm scales and feel strength flow into him. And Lyra said they were sharing their energy and considered him worthy, and that was rare. 2 weeks after the attack, Jake was cleared to leave medical, and he expected to go back to his little maintenance quarters and his old job. But Lord Theron summoned him to private quarters that overlooked the station through massive curved windows and offered him a drink that tasted like starlight. Theron said he had a proposal and Jake should listen before refusing, and Jake nodded and tried not to look nervous and failed, and the Lord smiled slightly and said there was no need for fear, and Jake was not a prisoner. The Lord explained that what happened in the market changed things and the assassination attempt failed because of Jake, and the radical groups were scrambling, and the political situation between humans and elder races was shifting, and Jake was at the center of it whether he wanted to be or not. Jake said he did not want to be at the center of anything and just wanted to fix cooling units and stay out of trouble, and Theron said that was no longer possible, and the galaxy knew his name and face and what he did, and ignoring it would not make it go away. The Lord asked if Jake would consider staying on as Lyra's personal guard and cultural advisor to the Sylvan Court, and Jake almost choked on his drink and said he was just a maintenance worker who got lucky and survived something stupid and had no training for this. Theron leaned back and said Jake was wrong on several counts, and first he was not lucky, he was selfless, and there was a difference, and second he survived, because he acted without hesitation, and third his lack of formal training was exactly what made him valuable. Jake did not understand and said so, and Theron explained that the elder races had grown careful over their long lives, and they calculated everything, and weighed risk against reward before acting, and they had lost something that humans still carried naturally. The Lord said Lyra needed to learn this before she took the throne someday, and she needed to understand the people she would protect, and humans were spreading across the galaxy faster than anyone predicted, and the next era belonged to races who burned bright and fast. Jake asked what he would learn from this, and Theron smiled and said his daughter needed to understand humans, and Jake was human, and represented something the elder races forgot, and that made him the perfect teacher, even if he did not know he was teaching. Before Jake could answer, Lyra appeared in the doorway with both dragons and asked if he said yes, yet, and Jake looked at her hopeful expression and remembered how she cried over him when he was wounded, and how she visited every day and brought her dragons to meet him. He looked at Ember and Frost, who watched him with ancient intelligence and made that purring thunder sound, and he looked at Lord Theron, who somehow decided a maintenance worker was worth this chance, and he thought about going back to fixing cooling units. He said yes, and Lyra smiled so bright it hurt, and Ember and Frost roared loud enough to shake the windows, and Theron nodded like he expected this answer, and said they would start tomorrow, and Jake wondered what he just agreed to. The next morning started early, and Lyra came to get him from his new quarters, which were 10 times bigger than his old maintenance room, and had windows that showed space and furniture that adjusted to his body, and he still was not used to any of it. She brought him to a training room where a Sylvan warrior named Commander Vex waited, and he was tall and muscular and had scars across his face and arms, and he looked at Jake like he was looking at a bug and said, they had much work to do. The training was brutal, and Jake learned quickly that his 3-month human military service was nothing compared to Sylvan combat training, and Vex did not go easy on him and threw him across the room more times than he could count. Lyra watched from the side with Ember and Frost, and sometimes she winced when Jake hit the floor hard, and sometimes she called out encouragement, and Vex told her to be quiet and let the human learn, and she glared at him but obeyed. After training, Lyra took Jake to language lessons, and a patient teacher named Elder Mira tried to teach him Sylvan. And the language was musical and flowing, and Jake's human tongue could not make half the sounds, and Mira sighed a lot but kept trying. Then came etiquette lessons and court protocol, and how to address different ranks, and when to bow, and when to kneel, and what gestures meant insult and what meant respect. And Jake's head spun with information, and he forgot most of it immediately. Lyra found this funny and said, not to worry, because he would learn eventually, and most court members would forgive mistakes from a human since they did not expect him to know better anyway, and Jake was not sure if that was comforting or insulting, Dinner was formal, and Jake sat at a long table with Lord Theron and Lyra and several court advisors, and they spoke in Sylvan, and he understood maybe one word in 10 and felt completely lost until Lyra switched to English and translated quietly. The advisors looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, and one older Sylvan woman asked Theron directly why he was allowing a human at court, and if this was wise, and Theron said time would tell. But he trusted his instincts. Jake went to bed exhausted and overwhelmed, and wondering if he made a huge mistake. 3 months passed in a blur of training and lessons and formal dinners, and Jake slowly started to understand what Lord Theron meant about him being valuable. And it had nothing to do with fighting skills or court manners, and everything to do with how he saw the world differently. Commander Vex still threw him across the training room regularly, but now Jake could block maybe 1 attack in 5, and Vex actually nodded once, which Lyra said was the highest praise he ever gave. And Jake felt proud despite his bruises. The language lessons improved, and he could understand basic Sylvan now and speak enough to be polite. And Elder Mira stopped sighing every lesson and sometimes even smiled when he got pronunciation right. And that felt like winning court protocol was still confusing. But Jake learned the important parts and figured out that most of the rules were about showing respect, and if he just treated everyone with basic decency, he could get away with not knowing the fancy gestures. Lyra spent most of her time with him, and she said it was part of his training as her cultural advisor. But Jake suspected she just enjoyed having someone who did not treat her like fragile royalty. And they talked about everything, from station life to philosophy. Ember and Frost were always nearby, and Jake learned to read their moods and body language, and they communicated through emotions more than sounds, and sometimes he swore they were laughing at him when he messed up, but it felt affectionate. Not mean Lord Theron included Jake in council meetings now, and ancient beings debated colony rights and trade routes and political alliances, and at first Jake just listened and tried to understand, but eventually Theron started asking his opinion. The first time shocked everyone, including Jake, and the question was about a human mining colony that wanted to expand into territory that the Sylvan claimed but barely used, and the council thought the humans were being greedy and short-sighted, Jake said. Maybe the humans just saw empty space that could feed families and create jobs, and they did not understand why anyone would claim land they were not using and their lives were short, so waiting a century for permission felt like forever. The council went quiet, and one elder said that was precisely the problem with humans, and they took without asking, and Jake said humans asked all the time, but when the answer was wait 100 years, they stopped asking and just did it. Theron looked pleased, and Lyra smiled at him, and the council grumbled, but eventually agreed to negotiate faster timelines with the colony, and Jake realized his job was not to know court manners, but to explain human thinking to people who never had to rush. An ambassador from the Krell Empire arrived for a formal dinner, and the Krell were warriors who respected strength above all, and the ambassador was massive and covered in scales and had eyes like a predator, and he clearly did not respect humans. He challenged Lyra during the meal and suggested that hiding behind a human guard showed weakness, and implied that the Sylvan were becoming soft, and Lyra stayed calm. But Jake felt Ember and Frost tense beside him, and their scales started to glow with heat. Lyra smiled and asked the ambassador if he would like to test his theory, and the Krell laughed and said he would enjoy proving his point. And Theron looked at Jake and raised an eyebrow like asking if he was ready. Jake was not ready, but he stood up anyway and said he would accept the challenge on Princess Lyra's behalf, and the ambassador looked delighted and said the human had courage if not sense, and they moved to a training room. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, and Jake used every trick Vex taught him and fought like his life depended on it, and the Krell was twice his size and trained since birth, but Jake was fast and desperate, and when he saw an opening, he took it without thinking. He got inside the ambassador's guard and used the Krell's own momentum against him and threw him into a wall and jumped on his back and got an arm around his throat and squeezed until the ambassador tapped out and yielded. The room went silent and then erupted in noise, and the Krell ambassador stood up and rubbed his throat and looked at Jake with new respect and said, "Humans fought like they had nothing to lose," and that was terrifying. Theron corrected him and said, "Humans fought like they had everything to lose." And that made all the difference, and the ambassador laughed and clapped Jake on the shoulder hard enough to bruise and said he understood now why the princess kept him close. Lyra hugged Jake right there in front of everyone and did not care about protocol, and Ember and Frost wrapped around them both and purred, and Jake felt like maybe he was starting to belong here. After that night, other ambassadors treated him differently, and they asked his opinion in meetings and invited him to informal gatherings, and slowly Jake became part of the court. Instead of just a curiosity, Lyra started taking him on diplomatic missions, and they visited human colonies and mining stations and trade outposts, and she watched how he talked to workers and families and how they responded to direct, honest speech instead of careful diplomatic language. She began changing her own approach and dropped some of the formal speech patterns that created distance between speaker and listener, and other ambassadors noticed and some approved, while others muttered about human influence corrupting traditions. Jake did not care about court politics and just tried to help Lyra connect with the people she would someday rule. And she was a fast learner and genuinely cared about everyone, whether they were ancient elders or young human miners. They visited a colony on the edge of Sylvan space, and the settlers were struggling because their equipment kept breaking down and supply ships came rarely. And they felt forgotten by both human and elder governments. Lyra listened to their problems and asked Jake what could be done, and he said they needed better trade routes and regular supply schedules, and maybe some Sylvan technology that could work in harsh environments. She made it happen, and within a month the colony had new equipment and regular supply ships, and the settlers could not believe that a Sylvan princess actually helped them, and word spread fast through human space. More colonies started reaching out and asking for help, and Lyra worked with Jake to create programs that connected human settlements with elder resources and trade networks, and slowly the gap between species started to shrink. Theron watched all this with approval and told Jake privately that he was doing exactly what was needed, and the galaxy was changing and needed bridges between old and new, and Lyra was becoming that bridge thanks to Jake's influence. Jake said he was just being himself, and Theron smiled and said that was the point. And sometimes the most valuable thing someone could do was show others a different way of seeing. During one diplomatic mission, a human settlement celebrated their founding day with music and dancing and food, and they invited Lyra to join, and she looked nervous because Sylvan celebrations were formal and quiet. And this was neither. Jake took her hand and pulled her into the dancing and showed her the simple steps, and she laughed and moved with natural grace, and the settlers cheered and clapped, and Ember and Frost watched from above and seemed to smile. That night, after they returned to the ship, Lyra told Jake she never felt so alive and free, and asked why human celebrations were so different, and he said, because humans knew time was short, so they celebrated hard while they could. She got quiet and then said she was learning more from him than any teacher ever taught her, and he was showing her how to really live instead of just existing through centuries, and Jake did not know what to say to that. They sat together watching stars pass by the window, and Ember and Frost curled around them, and Jake felt something shift between them and wondered if she felt it too. The next morning brought news that changed everything, and another assassination attempt was planned, and this time targeting a ceremony where Lyra would dedicate a new human colony, and security said they should cancel. But Lyra refused. She said canceling would show weakness and prove the radicals could control her through fear, and Jake agreed but insisted on personally checking all security arrangements, and Theron gave him full authority to do whatever needed. The colony dedication ceremony took place on a human settlement called New Hope, and the name felt ironic given the circumstances, and Jake spent 3 days checking every security detail and training route and escape plan until even Commander Vex said he was being thorough. Lyra insisted on walking through the crowd instead of staying on the protected platform, and she said the whole point was connecting with people, and hiding behind barriers defeated the purpose, and Jake knew she was right, but hated it anyway. The ceremony started smoothly, and hundreds of settlers gathered to see the Sylvan princess, who actually cared about human colonies, and Lyra gave a speech in simple English about cooperation and shared futures, and the crowd loved her. Jake stayed close and scanned faces and rooftops and windows and looked for anything wrong, and his gut said something was off, but he could not spot it, and Ember and Frost circled overhead watching everything with dragon eyes that missed nothing. Then he saw it, and a figure on a rooftop moved wrong and sunlight glinted off metal, and Jake's body moved before his brain finished processing, and he shoved Lyra behind a support column as energy blasts tore through the space where she stood. The crowd screamed and scattered, and more shots came from different directions, and Jake realized this was coordinated and better planned than the market attack, and he pulled his sidearm and returned fire while pushing Lyra toward cover A. Group of human children froze in panic right in the line of fire, and their parents were running toward them, but would not make it. And Jake saw the shooter adjusting aim, and he made a choice. He threw himself in front of the kids and took the blast, meant for them, and it hit his leg, and he went down hard, and the pain was incredible, but he kept his weapon up and fired back until security neutralized. The threat Lyra was screaming his name and trying to reach him, but Ember and Frost landed between them and the shooters and roared so loud that windows shattered, and their scales glowed with heat that made the air shimmer. Security swarmed the area, and medics rushed forward, and Jake saw the children safe with their parents, and felt relieved. Even though his leg felt like it was on fire, and Lyra finally got past the dragons and dropped beside him. She was crying and yelling at him for being reckless again, and her hands glowed as she pressed them to his wound, and he tried to tell her he was fine, but she was not listening and just kept healing and crying. Lord Theron arrived within minutes, and he looked at Jake lying in a pool of blood and at Lyra desperately trying to heal him, and at the children standing nearby who would be dead without Jake's intervention. The Lord knelt beside Jake and took his hand and pressed it to his forehead in a gesture that made Lyra gasp, and the crowd go silent, and Jake did not understand but felt the weight of it. Later Lyra explained that her father just accepted Jake as family in the Sylvan way, and not just an employee or guard but someone who belonged to their house and their people, and that almost never happened with outsiders. The recovery took weeks, and Jake hobbled around, with a cane, while his leg healed, and Lyra brought him reports and updates and sat with him during physical therapy. And somewhere in those quiet moments, he realized he loved her. He did not mean to fall in love with an alien princess, and knew it. Was probably stupid and would cause problems, but the heart did not care about logic or politics or the fact that she would live thousands of years while he barely made it to 80. She was brilliant and kind and brave, and she laughed at his jokes and listened to his stories about growing up on a human colony, and she treated him like an equal, instead of a servant. And Ember and Frost accepted him as pack. He tried to hide his feelings, because what could he offer her? And he was just human. And she was royalty, and their worlds were too different. But apparently he was not as subtle as he thought. Lyra came to his quarters one evening and found him on the balcony watching stars, and she stood beside him quietly, and then asked if he was avoiding her, and he said no too quickly, and she smiled sadly. She said she could feel something was different, and he was pulling away, and if she did something wrong, he should tell her because she valued his friendship above almost anything, and Jake felt his heart break a little. He almost lied and almost made an excuse, but he spent months teaching Lyra about human honesty and directness. So he told her the truth and said he was in love with her, and knew it was impossible, and was trying to deal with it without making things awkward. She stared at him and did not say anything for a long moment, and Jake wished the floor would open up and swallow him. And then she started laughing, and he felt confused and hurt until she grabbed his face. She kissed him, and it was gentle and fierce at the same time, and when she pulled back, her eyes were bright. And she said he was an idiot, and she had been waiting months for him to notice how she felt. Jake said that was impossible because she was a princess and he was nobody. And she laughed again and said that was exactly the kind of stupid human thinking that made her love him, and status meant nothing compared to who someone really was. They kissed again, and Ember and Frost appeared on the balcony and wrapped around them both and purred, and Jake felt their approval and happiness flow through the bond they shared with Lyra, and realized the dragons knew before he did. That night they talked until dawn, and Jake worried about what Lord Theron would say and what the court would think, and how this could possibly work when they lived such different lifespans. Lyra said they would figure it out together, and her father already accepted Jake as family. So that was half the battle, and the court could complain, but ultimately it was her choice who she loved. Jake asked about the lifespan issue, and she got quiet and said that was the one thing she could not fix. And yes, it would hurt someday. But would he rather have 50 years of happiness together or a lifetime of regret for not trying? He chose happiness, and they both knew it came with an expiration date, but decided it was worth it anyway, because that was very human, and she was learning to think like humans did. Lord. Theron found them together the next morning, and Jake expected anger or disappointment. But the Lord just looked tired and fond and said he knew this would happen the moment Jake threw himself over Lyra without hesitation. The Lord explained that humans loved as intensely as they fought, and that was both beautiful and concerning. And Lyra was old enough to make her own choices, but she needed to understand the consequences and be prepared for the pain that would come. Lyra said she understood and was willing to accept it. And Theron looked at Jake and said he better be worth it. And Jake promised to spend every day proving he was. The court reacted exactly as expected, and half were scandalized, and the other half were curious. And a few ancient elders complained about tradition and bloodlines and succession, and Jake offered to step away, but Lyra refused. She stood before the full council and said she would not hide her relationship and would not apologize for choosing someone who made her better, and if that bothered them, they could deal with it. Theron supported her and said the world was changing, and clinging to old ways would leave them behind, and sometimes tradition needed to bend or it would break, and the council grumbled, but accepted it. Some court members warmed to Jake after that and saw how happy Lyra was and how her work improved when she was not lonely, and they admitted that maybe a human perspective was valuable, even in personal matters. Others stayed cold and made comments about improper influence and questioned whether Jake was using her for status. And Lyra shut that down fast by pointing out that Jake literally took blaster shots for her before they even knew each other's names. The radical groups who tried to kill Lyra were furious and sent threats and said Jake proved that humans were corrupting elder races, and some colonies on both sides got nervous about human-Sylvan relations. But more people supported them than opposed them. And colonists said if a princess and a maintenance worker could bridge the gap, then maybe everyone else could try too. And slowly public opinion shifted in their favor. Jake kept working as cultural advisor and now also as Lyra's partner, and the two roles blended together naturally. And they visited colonies and met with councils and slowly built networks that connected isolated settlements to larger communities. Ember and Frost were always with them, and Jake learned to communicate with them almost as well as Lyra did, and they taught him their language of images and emotions and sometimes gave him the strength to keep going. When exhaustion hit one day during a council meeting, an elder asked Jake directly what made him think he was worthy of their princess, and the room went quiet. Jake looked at the elder who asked the question, and the entire council waited for his answer, and Lyra tensed beside him, but he put a hand on hers and stood up calmly. He said he was not worthy and never claimed to be. And if they measured worth by bloodlines or centuries lived or ancient wisdom, then he failed completely and would always fail because he was human and mortal and ordinary. But he loved Lyra with everything he had and would protect her with his life, and already proved that twice, and he made her happy and helped her become a better leader. And if that was not enough, then nothing he said would change their minds anyway. The room stayed quiet, and then Lord Theron started laughing. And the sound was so unexpected that everyone stared, and he said that was the most honest answer anyone ever gave the council. And honesty was becoming rare among people who lived long enough to learn careful speech. The elder who asked looked thoughtful, and finally nodded and said, perhaps bloodlines were not the only measure of worth, and clearly the princess saw something in this human that they were too old to recognize, and maybe that was the real problem. After the meeting, Lyra kissed Jake in front of everyone and did not care who saw, and Ember and Frost roared approval, and the court realized this relationship was not going away and started accepting it. Months passed and turned into a year, and Jake settled into his life at court and still found it strange sometimes, but it felt like home now, and Lyra was talking about marriage, and Jake wanted that but worried about the legal complications. The council debated for weeks about whether a human could marry into the royal family, and ancient laws about bloodlines created problems nobody anticipated, and some elders argued it would dilute the Sylvan legacy. Lyra argued back that bloodlines meant nothing if the family died out from isolation and refusing to adapt, and she would rather have a short, happy life with Jake than a long, lonely one following rules that no longer made sense. Theron supported her and said the law was meant to protect the family, not imprison it, and traditions that could not bend would eventually break, and the council needed to choose between strict tradition and survival. The debate went on for months, and Jake told Lyra they did not need official marriage, and he was happy just being with her. But she refused to accept that and said he deserved the same recognition as any partner. Finally, the council voted, and it was close, but they agreed to allow the marriage with conditions, and the main one was that any children would be raised understanding both human and Sylvan cultures. And Jake laughed, because that was his job anyway. They married in a ceremony that blended human and Sylvan customs, and Jake wore formal robes that felt ridiculous, until Lyra said he looked perfect and meant it, and Ember and Frost served as honor guards. Theron officiated, and gave a speech about bridges between peoples and strength found in choosing connection over isolation, and how his daughter taught him that wisdom sometimes came from unexpected sources. The ceremony mixed Sylvan music with human traditions, and they exchanged vows in both languages, and when they kissed, the crowd cheered and dragons roared, and Jake felt like maybe impossible things could happen after all. Their life together fell into a rhythm, and Lyra took on more responsibilities as she prepared to eventually rule, and Jake worked beside her and helped translate between human directness and Sylvan diplomacy. They visited new colonies and old settlements, and everywhere they went, people saw proof that cooperation between species was possible, and more mixed communities started forming and the radical groups lost support. Jake trained other humans who wanted to serve as cultural liaisons, and he taught them what Theron once taught him about how humans had a gift for acting without overthinking, and the trick was helping longer-lived races remember they once had that gift too. Some of his students were former maintenance workers and miners and farmers, and none of them had formal training, but all of them understood human thinking better than any diplomat, and that made them valuable. Years passed faster than Jake expected, and he was 30 now, and Lyra looked exactly the same as the day he met her, and sometimes that hurt, but mostly he just felt grateful for every day they had together. They talked about children, and Lyra wanted them but worried about Jake watching them grow old while he aged and died, and he said that was just part of being human, and his parents died when he was young, but he still valued the time they had. She cried when he said that and held him tight and said she understood now why humans fought so hard for everything and lived so intensely, and it was because they knew nothing lasted forever. They had a daughter and named her Hope after the colony where Jake saved those children, and she had Lyra's silver hair and Jake's brown eyes and grew faster than Sylvan children and slower than human children, and was perfect. Ember and Frost adored her and let her climb on them and taught her dragon speech before human words, and Hope laughed when they purred and showed no fear of creatures that terrified most adults. Lord Theron was a wonderful grandfather and spoiled Hope constantly, and said she reminded him of Lyra at that age, but with more human energy and curiosity, and he loved watching her explore everything. Jake was 35 when the sickness started, and human doctors said it was just age catching up. But Sylvan healers knew better and said his body was wearing out faster than normal, from the blaster wounds that never fully healed. Lyra tried everything to help and used every healing technique she knew and consulted with the best Sylvan medical experts. But they all said the same thing, and human bodies were not built to take that much damage and survive long term. Jake told her it was okay, and he lived an incredible life that most humans never dreamed of, and got to love her and meet their daughter and see real change happen in the galaxy, and that was enough. She was not ready to let go, and neither was Hope, who was only 3, and barely understood why Daddy was always tired now. And Jake tried to make every moment count and teach her everything he could before it was too late. On his last day, the whole court came to pay respects, and former students visited, and colonists he helped sent messages, and Jake realized he touched more lives than he ever knew. Lyra stayed beside him, holding his hand, and Ember and Frost lay at the foot of the bed, and Hope curled up against his side, and Theron sat in a chair reading one of Jake's favorite Earth books aloud. Jake told Lyra she was the best thing that ever happened to him, and to keep building bridges and never stop connecting with people, and to teach Hope about both worlds so she could belong to both. He told Hope to be brave and kind and never hesitate to help someone in trouble, even if it seemed scary, and she promised through tears, and he held her close. He told Theron, "Thank you for taking a chance on a maintenance worker," and the Lord said no thank you for saving his daughter and teaching her how to really live. The end came quietly, and Lyra felt it through their bond before his body stopped, and she screamed, and Ember and Frost roared grief that shook the station, and Hope cried and did not understand. They held a funeral that blended human and Sylvan traditions, and buried him with honors usually reserved for warriors and heroes, and thousands of people from dozens of species came to pay respects. Lyra spoke about how one ordinary human changed everything by simply doing what felt right without calculating the cost, and how that was humanity's greatest gift and their greatest strength. Hope grew up surrounded by love and became a bridge between species even more than her parents were, and she had Jake's kindness and Lyra's wisdom, and the dragons taught her to see the world through ancient eyes. Lyra ruled for centuries and never remarried, and stayed true to Jake's memory, and kept building the bridges they started together, and the galaxy became more connected and cooperative than anyone thought possible. She told their story often and said that humans taught the elder races something vital, and that sometimes 50 years of love was worth more than 1,000 years of careful distance, and connection mattered more than caution. The legacy Jake left was not in bloodlines or monuments, but in changed hearts and opened minds and new ways of seeing. And that lasted longer than any single life ever. Could Ember and Frost lived for centuries more, and they carried Jake's memory through their bond with Lyra and later with Hope, and they made sure every generation knew the story of the human who threw himself into danger without thinking twice. New liaisons trained at an academy that bore Jake's name, and they learned that the greatest power was not in grand gestures, but in simple choices to help when help was needed, and to love without counting the cost. The radical groups that tried to kill Lyra faded away, because their message of division could not compete with proof of cooperation, and eventually even their descendants admitted that maybe the human was right. Hope had children of her own, and they had children, and Jake's bloodline spread through Sylvan and human populations both, and his legacy lived in genetics and ideas, and changed futures. Lyra lived longer than most Sylvan, and when she finally passed, she went peacefully, knowing she spent her centuries well and that Jake would be proud of everything they built together. The galaxy remembered them both, and told their story as proof that love could cross any boundary, and that sometimes the most unlikely people created the biggest changes, and that courage came in many forms. And somewhere on a trading station that orbited a dying star, there was a memorial plaque that read simply, "Jake Morrison saved a princess and changed a galaxy by doing